Shalom, and welcome to this edition of Contextual Bible Study. My name is Denny Thompson. Now, for the next few sessions, actually the next 4 sessions, we're going to be on the shores of the Dead Sea. Today, in the next session, 2 sessions total, we're going to be at a town called Qumran. Now, at Qumran was a group called the Essenes who lived there, and they wrote something called the Dead Sea Scrolls, I'm sure you've heard about. It's very important, so we are going to spend 2 sessions on this. Then we're going to drop down to the bottom of the Dead Sea, near the bottom, a place called Masada, a very, very popular tourist destination. Some important things happen up there. And then we're going to go back up to Engedi, just above Masada a little bit. So that's what we're looking at for the next few weeks here. So today we're going to begin with the Dead Sea Scrolls, Part 1. Okay, now this is a video from Preserving Bible Times. And I've used those quite a bit in the past here, but to give you an idea again what this shoreline looks like of the Dead Sea. Now we're at the northern part of the Dead Sea in the area we're looking at today. You can see these extreme cliffs. They're over 1,000 feet straight down in many cases. This would have been the area that David wandered around when he was trying to escape Saul chasing him. And so many stories happen here. The wilderness above, of course, is where Jesus was in the wilderness at one time. Very, very rugged area. But in the northern part of the Dead Sea is a very remote town where a group of people decided to leave Jerusalem and go down and live there, called the Essenes. And it's called Qumran. Now here's a second little video. You can see Qumran right there. We're going to kind of go from Jericho down to Qumran on the northern tip and look at it a little bit closer. So here we go. We're going to put this in motion. This is from an organization called Bible Stock. You can see this wadi, this cliff right here, or this canyon, I should say. And in the middle of that canyon is actually where this area is, an area called Qumran. And along the slopes are all kinds of caves, which are going to be very significant in the story because that's where these scrolls, these ancient scrolls that were so incredibly important, and we're going to learn why that's true, were stored to try to save them from the onslaught of the Romans at one point who were coming into this area. Now we're getting ahead of the story here, of course, but just to kind of lay this out in an overview. The caves you're looking at right there are probably the most famous. They're really, really distinct. They're right over that extreme valley. Okay. All right. So the modern day story of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we're of course going to go way back to learn about the scrolls themselves, but when they were discovered, that would be the modern day story. It was by a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad el-Dib in 1947, and he simply was trying to chase one of his goats out of a cave. His goat had gone into a cave. He threw a stone into the cave beyond his goat to scare him back out. What he did is he hit a clay jar, and he could hear it. He thought, what's that? So he went in and took a look at it. And that's where the whole story of the Dead Sea Scrolls began, with that one incident right there. Now, eventually there were many jars found. Most of them were empty. A few contained ancient scrolls. And they removed at that initial time period, very soon after this happened, 7 complete scrolls. Because they had been written on parchment that kind of looked like shoe leather. That's kind of what this Bedouin thought. Maybe this is some kind of shoe leather. Okay. And this right here is that initial cave. We call that cave number 1. That's where that first discovery was made. And this is what it looks like from inside of cave 1, looking back out into the valley down towards the Dead Sea. Now, many jars were found. Most of them were empty, as I mentioned, and a few contained the ancient scrolls. Now, of these 7 complete scrolls, since they're written on this parchment, as I mentioned, that's animal hide, and looked like shoe leather. They sold them to a shoemaker named Kondo in Bethlehem. Now, Kondo purchased them, not knowing they were ancient scrolls, but saw writing on them. 3 of them were purchased by an Israeli archaeologist named Eliezer Sukenik. The other 4 were purchased by a Bethlehem church leader who eventually sold them in the U.S. Okay, on a trip over there. Interesting enough, Yigal Yadin, the son of Eleazar Sukenik, now putting all these names together, the son of this archaeologist, okay? Now his name was eventually changed to Yigal Yadin. His name initially was Yigal Sukenik. It was changed because David Ben Gurion wanted him to change. He became somebody very, very important in the IDF. But anyway, it just so happened that Yigal Yadin was in the United States when this ad about these scrolls, these 4 scrolls, he saw it in the paper, he bought them, and he brought them back to Israel. Yadin later became the chief archaeologist of Masada. Okay, this is kind of an amazing story how all this happened. So now we got these 7 scrolls back in Israel again. This is him, Yigal Yadin. So Yigal Yadin not only was an archaeologist, but also he was the second chief of staff in the IDF. That's actually partly where that name got changed from Sukenik to Yadin. All right. And he was the chief archaeologist at Masada, which is very important. We'll learn about that in a future teaching here. Okay, he was really the main guy there, unlocking the whole story. Now, these 7 scrolls, these 7 complete scrolls, were all put in the newly created Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, and the building looks like this. It's made to kind of look like an ancient jar, I guess. And that's what it looks like up close, and here's from a little bit of a distance. It's really an amazing place. It's all climate set up for these scrolls, and it's a little bit dark in that area, but it's lit up in the areas so you can certainly see the scrolls easily. All right, so that's called the Shrine of the Book, and that's where they are. But in the early 1950s, archaeology really ramped up in this area. Remember, the first discovery was 47. Qumran at that time was under the control of Jordan. Jordan controlled all this area. So it was a little bit tricky trying to get the archaeologists in there. They had to get permission. Eventually, 12 caves were explored, and they yielded 900 scrolls. Remember, initially there were 7, and then tens and tens of thousands of fragments. So it got much bigger. Now, every book of the Hebrew Bible was found, with one exception, the book of Esther, and that's interesting. We'll come back to that later. There are several sectarian documents, like something called the Community Rules, which told us all about these people who lived here, some apocryphal and pseudepigraphal texts, a few copies of the Septuagint, which is the Greek copy, or the Greek translation of the Old, what we call the Old Testament, and some Aramaic writings. All right, now the most famous cave is this one right here, that we saw a little bit earlier, but Cave 4, because it so much stands out. In terms of look, in terms of kind of being the picture of Masada. But inside of Cave 4, they found over 500 different scrolls, but not in jars. They were scattered. They were just almost disintegrated all over the floor in massive numbers of pieces that they had to try to put together. What a puzzle piece that would be, to try to interpret what are these scrolls? What books of the Bible are they? Now, who went there? In other words, who was at this place in the desert? And why did they go there? Now, let's first look at there's going to be one of the 3 groups of leaders in Israel. I want to look at those 3 groups right now. On the left, we have the Sadducees, or kind of the elitists. They were the ones that kind of in charge of the temple, that type of thing. A lot of them are extremely corrupt. The Pharisees, which were really that represented the common people. Okay. And then we had a group called the Essenes. And the Essenes didn't really agree with either of the other 2. They wanted something different. And those are the people who are eventually going to settle down into this area. Okay. All right. Now let's go to take a look at this idea of the corruption in the leadership of the temple, because this is central to understanding why the Essenes are going to establish this community. Now, I have mentioned this before in a previous presentation, but just to kind of go back over it quickly. Now, Josephus recorded that from Aaron, the first high priest, from about 1300 BC roughly, to all the way to 37 BC, there were 55 high priests, all from the line of Aaron, as they were supposed to be according to the scriptures. But then during this time period from 37 BC to 70 AD, when the Romans had control of a lot of this area, There are 28 high priests, only 2 from the priestly line of Aaron. They become like purchased positions, very, very corrupt. Okay, so the first 1,200 years are 55, and next 107 years are 28. So it was very corrupt. There was a lot of turnover, and it was not at all the way God had set it up, according to his word. Now, so this temple became this financial center where taxes are paid, there were money exchanges, sacrificial animals were purchased, but there was massive corruption. In fact, at times, they couldn't even get enough priests to do the sacrifices and all these ceremonial activities that are supposed to be going on in the temple, because a lot of them were down here in the theater watching some very corrupt plays. That's how bad it became. And of course, that's the setting of Jesus entering the temple area, who began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, is it not written, my house will be a house of prayer for all nations? Okay. Now, so obviously Jesus, this is a situation where he got extremely upset because he saw this corruption, all that they were doing to the worshipers, bringing in their animals for sacrifice, and they wouldn't accept them. They had to buy one at a very high price. The temple tax exchanges were incredibly corrupt. Anyway, so that's all going on. But in addition to all this corruption, wherever the Gentiles worship, because he said, my house is to be a house of prayer for all nations. And this buying and selling was going on in the Gentile court. So they're being crowded right out. But you have made it a den of robbers. And Jesus is quoting Jeremiah 7. Now, what's interesting about that, one reason I put this in here again, is to show you this. 20 years before this happened, listen to this. The priesthood in Jerusalem had become corrupt. Of course, remember, it happened even before this time period that I showed you, because it blended in a lot of Hellenism, a lot of the Roman ideas too. Okay, here's what happened. One Essene was so incensed at the corruption of the temple worship and using the Gentile court, he drove 6,000 sheep into the temple court, jumped on a dove crate and shouted, my house shall be a house of prayer for all nations. And you have turned it into a den of thieves. Wow. Okay, that's interesting. So the Essenes were fully aware of the corruption in the temple. And that's going to be central to them wanting to change things. Now, I want to point out this incident right here. This was dealing with the Passover meal. And Jesus had said to his disciples, he told them to go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Say to the owner of the house he enters, the teacher asks, where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? He will show you to a large upper room, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there. Now, this is pretty fascinating here, because a man carrying a jar of water is not at all what you would find in Jerusalem, because that was a job of women. So, what does this have to do with anything? Well, the Essenes, almost none of them were married. They remained not married, and we're going to look at that story later, why that is. But in Jerusalem, to find a man carrying a jar of water very likely meant that was an Essene. So it's very likely that the upper room was the house of an Essene. Okay. Now, this is kind of a map of what Jerusalem looked like in Jesus' time period. And this area right in here, in this upper city, the upper city is the wealthy part of town where the priests live. This was the area that the Essenes lived in. And this actually is where, I'm going to make a little circle here, okay, that it's outside the wall, because that wall's not built in the right place. This is the old city you're looking at, is where the upper room is, the traditional upper room. That was the Essene quarter way back in those days. That's where they lived. Now, most of them are going to leave Jerusalem, as we'll learn. But during that time period, there were still a few that lived there. Okay, this is Herod's palace, and surrounding Herod's palace were all these beautiful homes, these wealthy priests. And many of them, like I say, were very, very corrupt. And that's why the Essenes are going to make this protest movement, and most of them are going to leave. Okay, this is kind of maybe a artist rendition of what they might look like. So they use this money of corruption, many of them, to create these type of homes like this. Okay. But then we have the Essenes, this priestly class in Jerusalem who were so devoted to purity and prayer and following the scriptures. Very, very close. And they are going to be just lividly upset about what is going on here. Most of them were of the priestly line of Aaron and Zadok. The Essenes believed that the Pharisees, okay, the Hebrew word for the Pharisees means separatists, were very lax. They were doers of smooth interpretations, they described them. So in other words, the Pharisees were going against most of the corruption of the Sadducees, but the Essenes says not good enough. They weren't doing it with enough, gusto. They weren't really doing it correctly because they're still allowing all this corruption. So there was a gap or kind of a barrier between the Essenes and the Pharisees in that respect. So later, they were called Essenes. Actually, not initially. They called themselves the Yaqid, the community. So that's actually what they call themselves, the community, the Yaqid. And there's some discussion on whether or not the term Essene is correct or not. But we're going to go ahead and use that for now to describe these people. All right. So they were so tired of priestly corruption. Many left for other towns in Israel. One main group traveled into the Judean wilderness to the shores of the Dead Sea to a town called Qumran. We've looked at briefly. So you can see Qumran down there in the north end. So why the wilderness? Why in the world would they go to a place like that? Well, one of the key reasons we're going to look at right now, they were preparing for the coming Messiah. Okay, now remember the scriptures are vital to them, absolutely central and vital. And that's where they're going to go down to Qumran. So what scriptures? Well, this prophecy that in the wilderness, a voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths in the desert or wilderness, kind of used in conjunction, a highway for our God. Now, straight paths and the glory of the Lord will be revealed. Now, this whole idea of make straight paths is going to be understood that that's holy living, that they would follow the word exactly, completely. And then the glory of the Lord will be revealed. Now, that was an understanding that the Messiah will come. So they believe by them going into the wilderness and living this holy life, they can bring about the Messiah. Okay? So that's what they're going to do. Now, remember this back when we looked at this whole idea of shepherding. This idea of the straight paths, okay, the straight paths or the paths of righteousness, or the path of life in a sense, was a path of following God's word, following the shepherd. And these other paths are all represent sin. And then the idea of teshuvah means to return to this path. So that's what they were doing. They wanted to return and live the life of the straight path, the shepherd's path. Okay. All right. And they want to stay on the straight path. And that way the Messiah will come and they can fulfill the scriptures. They had to live holy lives, and they had to do it in the wilderness to make all this happen. So see, is that starting to make sense why they went into this incredibly remote place? All right. I just want to point this out too. I was just looking at this recently. Jesus on Matthew 24, when his disciples asked, when are you going to return? And he started to tell them what would it look like at the end of days. When he said this, okay, he said, take heed, no man deceive you. And he said, by this word deceive, what it actually meant in Greek, because this is all translated into Greek, I believe he was speaking Hebrew at the time, was interesting because it really is the same thing. It's the Greek word is planero, and it's a moral wandering of people who once marched on a well-worn path, now have chosen a new path leading off from the original. Planero is used agriculturally to describe an animal so lost he couldn't find his way back home. So really that is exactly the sin picture. And that's what Jesus is saying at the end of days it's going to be like, where people just wandered away from the path. They're making their own paths. They're making their own truth. Even what we're hearing, I'm the source of all truth, rather than the truth of the word, of what the Bible says. So Jesus even said that in the days. And again, this is translated into Greek, but he obviously was speaking in Hebrew. And just to show that that whole idea remains steady. Now, these views about the future, the end of days were at hand. There was to be soon a coming 40-year-long war between them, the sons of light, and everyone else called the sons of darkness. All right. These apocalyptic views that they had were really big. They talked about this a lot. Now, they called themselves the sons of light. Everybody else was called the sons of darkness. They also believed that God predetermines everything, including the outcome of the coming war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And they believed that the sons of light would win this coming war. They believed there would be two messiahs, not one, to come. And this is interesting. They believed that there would be a son of David, who was this warlike messiah, but there's also be a son of Aaron, kind of a priestly messiah. Isn't that interesting? It almost is parallel with the two roles of the coming of Jesus here, if we think about that. Now, to get admitted to the Essenes was not easy. You had to be unblemished, which meant adult males, no physical or mental handicaps. And there was a 2 to 3 year initiation period for them even to be admitted into this town. Now, why unblemished? Well, because they were going to live priestly lifestyles, walking that straight path, holy lifestyles, to bring about the Messiah and to fulfill his word, as we've learned. Now, if you were a full member, you were living a full priestly type lifestyle, even though not all of them were from priestly families. Okay, so they were kind of using the template of what a priest is supposed to do, and that's one of the ways that they decided they needed to live. They had to give up all their personal possessions, and they held everything in common. Now, in the Jerusalem temple, the priests who were on duty during the time period were celibate, okay, but only when they were on duty, because they were divided up into 24 courses or divisions of priests. And that's when they were to be separated from their wives and families. They left their wife and family only to return after. Now, the difference between that and these people, the Akid or the Essenes, is they consider themselves always on duty, living holy lives. So in other words, they always had to be celibate and they didn't marry. Now, historians Philo and Josephus and these other scrolls called the sectarian scrolls record a few stayed in Jerusalem, a few of the Essenes or the Akid. Many of them scattered to towns and villages all around Israel, married and had families. But most of them went to live in a town on the shores of the Dead Sea, Qumran, as I mentioned. It appears they did not marry, and they lived celibate lives. Because the graves verify this, they only found 3 women in the whole area. So it's probably pretty clear. So what did Qumran look like? We're going to look a little closer here, much closer. Looking at it from above, looking down on the town, it just looks like this. You can see the Dead Sea in the distance and how stark and how barren this area is. It was overlooking, if you see the caves on the right, we mentioned those before. Those are some of the caves the scrolls were put and they were discovered. But it's overlooking this canyon called a wadi. And the wadi, as remember from before, is a canyon created by water, rainfall from the upper highlands area, the Judean mountains, up where it does rain occasionally. And the water carves this canyon going down in this area. Now, this is an area that receives like 0 to 2 inches of rain a year. So the only water they could get was right here. And this water coming down this canyon once or twice a year at the most. Now, the ruins of ancient Qumran are in the foreground here, which we're going to look at. But right outside of the town was the main cemetery. Now, in the main cemetery, they found 1,200 total graves. Interestingly enough, the bodies were buried kind of in an unusual way. The feet were facing north and the head south. And they don't really know why that was. Kind of a bit of a mystery, but it was true. In the southern part of the town, actually kind of outside the town to the south a little bit, they found another cemetery where people were buried all directions, east, west, north, south, all over the place. So it's very, very different type cemetery. In the main cemetery, all but 3 were men. So there was only 3 women buried here. And that was one of these proofs that the fact that these men were celibate. But in that southern cemetery, there were many women and children. And initially, they thought that was all part of the original Qumran development. Then they discovered no, more testing. These are much more recent. These were Bedouin graves. So that was very different in that respect, too. Now, did they live right in the town itself? Probably a few did, but most did not. They lived in tents or they actually lived in the caves. The town is very tiny. Okay, what was daily life like in this town? Now, this is really, really strict. As remember, they had to live holy lives. They had to live the straight path. They were living this priestly life. So everything is extremely strict. And even to get in was amazingly difficult. Before dawn, there was prayers and songs. After prayer, they did their daily work. In the 5th hour of the day, they had the purification, which meant had to go into something called the mikvah, which we'll look at. Then they had this communal meal, and that was a big part of their community, having this meal together. After the meal, some worked, others were copying scrolls. After work, they had prayer. In the evening, they had more purifications and another meal. After the meal, 1/3 of the night study and prayer was spent in night study and prayer. So many of them didn't go to bed for the night, but they stayed up a good portion of the night, continuing on with the study and prayer. And then after the study, a period of rest. Very, very strict rules. Interrupting someone speaking would be 10 days expulsion. Falling asleep in a meeting, 10 days expulsion. Lying down in a session, 30 days expulsion. Knowingly lying, 6 months expulsion. Insulting intentionally, 1 year expulsion. Speaking angrily against the priest, a year expulsion. And speaking against the rules of the community, gone, banned forever. So it certainly was very, very strict living here because they had to live these holy lives to bring the Messiah. What they believed, were trying to fill out these prophecies. Now, all their money was shared in common, and they found this area, it's kind of like their bank area, where this was true. The money was shared in common. And some of these people did have a fair amount of resources when they lived up in Jerusalem. They were of the priestly class, most of them. Ritual impurity was so central to life here. Now, ritual impurity has nothing to do with sin. It had to do with coming into the presence of God. So in other words, when you're going to come into the presence of God, you had to be ritually pure. In that world, that meant entering the temple. Okay, now, so that's initially where this idea of ritual purity came from, going into the temple where God lives, where his presence was. They did not have to be in ritual purity state at other times. Okay, now remember, that's where this whole was based, the whole ideas were based on, but they're going to bring these ideas down to Qumran. Now, there's certain things and processes such as touching mildew, touching a lizard, touching a corpse, with a man, nocturnal emissions, a woman having her period. All of these types of things could lead to ritual impurity. So obviously these are not, this is not sin. These are just things that could happen. Now, in this little video right here from Bible Stock, we're going back to the temple for a minute to think about that. So when they wanted to worship in the temple, they had to be ritually pure. And everything is going to be based on this in Qumran. But even though this temple becomes so corrupt, they believed, and it had, and they were trying to bring this to kind of create this true purity back where they were going to live in the desert. It was based on what was going on up here. So when people came to worship in the temple, into the presence of God, they had to be ritually pure. And there was a whole series of mikvot, they're called, or mikvah, that are close to the temple that many of them were cleansed in before they could come into this area, which you're looking at right here. This is the main area, and that's the altar in front of you in the presence of God. And if you were a priest and you went into this inner area, well, that's another whole level of ritual purity that was involved, okay? So this purification before entering the temple for worship, for a long time, they wondered, how could people become purified? Where was an area that they could do that? And what about Pentecost, where 3,000 were baptized? Where did that take place? So that was all kind of interesting. So before 1967 war, this is kind of a little bit of a grainy picture, but right here, everything is like covered up, going up to the wall of the Temple Mount. You can see that Dome of the Rock in the distance where the temple stood, but you can't see any mikvah or mikvot here. But once this was uncovered after 67, they started to discover them everywhere. Now, here's some big ones right here, where they could put in something called living water and become ritually pure before they entered the temple. Here's another one here. And these are all over the place outside of the temple, outside of that. It's actually the southern wall of the temple. And also this right here, the Pool of Siloam. Down in this area was another spot where they could become ritually pure. For most people, to immerse themselves in the waters of a mikvah, would only be, that's what they had to do. But a mikvah had to have waters obtained at the hands of God. What does that mean? Well, that meant waters that came from a spring, a stream, a lake, a river, or a wadi flood. Okay, a cistern like this, a cistern is where just still water is poured into, didn't qualify because that's not at the hands of God, that's at the hands of men. So all of those mikvot, had to have living water in them, and what a job that was to get all that accomplished. Now, some impurities were worse than others, like the corpse impurity. So that goes back, remember that story of the Good Samaritan, the priest and Levite. So this whole idea of this man who was dead, or they thought was dead, or at least dying, entered into their whole ideas is what was going on there. Now let's go back to the town of Qumran. This is a diagram or kind of a picture of what it might have looked like. And within the town itself, it's a very small area, very small town. There were 10 mikvot, or mikvah singular. Here's 2 of them. They're all over the place. Why? Because ritual purity was central to the men of Qumran. It was so very important. This is a picture I took from Qumran itself, some of the diagrams that they have on the exhibits. But they indicate how when they entered the pools of the mikvah, they entered on one side, okay, like to the right, and then they would leave on the other side, or they entered on the right side, then leave on the other side to make sure they didn't touch somebody who had not become ritually pure yet. Okay, so once they become ritually pure, they had to leave on the other side and make sure they didn't touch anybody else. Now that sounds like, it sounds a little bit unusual to us, but that was like central to them. They believe ritual purity was so very, very important. You can see that little divider right here with the arrow pointing to it. Now, here's one of the expressions. No one may enter the water unless he has repented of his evil, because his uncleanness clings to all transgressions of his word. Okay, so they did carry with this idea of ritual purity, this idea of this purity of heart also, of repentance. So that was part of their process. They believed that they needed to live these holy lives and these straight paths to bring the Messiah. Another picture of a mikvah in Qumran. There are 10 of them, 10 main ones. Okay, and you can see another one. It's a little bit bigger one here. It's so important because they were like everywhere. They're all over the town, and there really weren't that many people who lived there. And another one. Now I'm going to show you one that's kind of interesting coming up right here. It's all kind of cracked. Evidence of an earthquake that hit this area, because this, of course, is an earthquake zone in 31 BC. You can see it there. And I've mentioned this before, this whole area is right on a massive earthquake zone. We learned about that when we learned about Sodom and different things. Okay, now, where could they get living water? All right, and I've kind of alluded to it, but let's look at it more specifically. When the rains came up in the mountains, the Judean mountains of Israel, the air kind of elevates, goes up above, and it's kind of like a sponge. It has moisture coming in off the Mediterranean Sea to the west. It's kind of dampish type air. As it goes up, it kind of takes this like a sponge having water. It kind of squeezes it out as it goes down into this very deep, dry valley. So the sponge just kind of like squeezes it out, and it rains on top of the mountains. And then the sponge is like empty. I'm just kind of setting up a visual here. That air is completely dry as it drops into that valley. So the water is going to be up above, and it's going to create these canyons as we've learned before. And it starts like this. The water starts just pouring down the canyons very fast above. And it goes on down bigger and bigger as it comes down. And this is a diagram of this area right here, where there you can see up above the flash flood waters. They created a dam here to block some of this water so that they could in turn kind of reroute it into their town. And you see that diversion channel, okay? They created a channel. We'll look at what that looks like and see where it says the Qumran settlement. They made the water be able to go down into their town. Now this classified as living water that they could use in their mikvot to become ritually pure, because it's water at the hands of God. It was rain. And so that qualifies as that. So here's where that actual dam is above, and that's like a carved into the rock that they did. And so as they begin to channel this water down through this area right here and down this channel, you can see it going down towards the town of Qumran. And you can see this very clear today as it goes down further. And right here is it coming into town itself, okay, into this area. So this was so central, this whole idea. And they spent all this time and effort to make sure they had this all set up as the water came into town. And they also had a large reservoir right here because they needed water for drinking too. And that's what this is going to wind up being. This becomes more like just still water, okay, more like a cistern actually. And this is what it looks like today. It's very large. You can see it when you're walking here. This is a really fun place to visit because you can just look at everything very, very close. Okay. And here's a watchtower right here. Okay. And this is what it looked like there, looking obviously kind of like to the north, because from the north is where the danger was. And that's actually where the danger is going to be coming from eventually. Okay. All right. So the future sighting from that particular area is actually going to be something very, very dangerous. It's actually going to be the destruction of Qumran. And from that north is going to come a Roman army, a very, very dark day in the history of Qumran. Now, I've only just kind of begun the town itself here. We're going to look at it much deeper next time, much more in some depth. The key parts, of course, is going to be the actual writing of the scrolls. But for now, I want to break this into two parts to not make it too terribly long. So this is part one. And then very soon we'll follow this up with part two to learn more about the key parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, their writings. And really, I want to show you too the connections to many, many other New Testament events. It's really fascinating. And we'll get into that for the next time. But in the meantime, I appreciate your watching this today, and my wish for you is shalom.